The gymnasium lights cast long shadows across the polished hardwood as Nate Harmon dribbled toward the three-point line, his Nikes squeaking against the floor in a rhythm that matched his thundering heartbeat. 26 years old now, beard where peach fuzz used to be, but the shot looked exactly the same arc, the same follow-through, the same moment of suspended time where everything hung in the balance. His palms were slick with sweat, despite the February chill seeping through the old windows of Jefferson High's gym. And he could feel the weight of every eye in the building pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. The crowd noise faded to a whisper as muscle memory took over. 10 years of private practice sessions in empty gyms and neighborhood courts, all leading to this one moment. His mind flashed back to that devastating night in 2014 when he'd stood in this exact spot. 17 years old and carrying the hopes of an entire small Indiana town, only to watch his shot clank off the rim and shatter dreams that had been building for months. The scholarship offers had dried up, the college recruiters had moved on, and he'd spent the next decade wondering if one moment could really define a lifetime. But tonight wasn't about redemption or second chances. Tonight was about something deeper, something that had taken him years to understand. As he bent his knees and aligned his shooting form, Nate realized that some wounds don't heal until you're ready to let them, and some shots are worth taking even when nobody's keeping score. The ball left his fingertips with a perfect rotation, tracing the same path through the air that had haunted his dreams for a decade. And for the first time in 10 years, Nate Harmon wasn't afraid of where it might land. Hello my friends, before we continue our story, leave your like, share the story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. The town of Cedar Falls, Indiana, population 8,400. Lived and breathed basketball, the way other places lived and breathed religion. Main Street businesses closed early on Friday nights during the season, and the local diner served Hoosier specials, named after legendary players who'd made it out of town on basketball scholarships. The gymnasium at Jefferson High held 2,800 people, more than a third of the town's population, and on game nights it felt like the entire world had compressed into that one building where dreams were made and broken under the unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights. Nate Harmon had been born into this basketball-obsessed culture. The son of Mike Harmon, who'd managed the town's grain elevator for 30 years, and Sarah Harmon, who taught 4th grade at Cedar Falls Elementary. They lived in a modest 2-story house on Maple Street, where the front yard was dominated by a weathered basketball hoop that Mike had installed when Nate was 7 years old. The backyard was too small for proper practice, but the driveway was perfect for endless hours of shooting, and neighbors had grown accustomed to the rhythmic bounce of a basketball echoing through the neighborhood long after sunset. By his sophomore year, Nate had established himself as the most promising player Jefferson High had seen in a generation. He stood 6'4" with a wingspan that seemed to stretch forever, and his jump shot had a consistency that made opposing coaches redesign their entire game plans. College scouts started showing up to games, filling the visitor section with clipboards and serious expressions, and local sports writers began mentioning his name in the same breath as legendary Indiana players who'd gone on to win championships and play professionally. The weight of expectation settled on his shoulders like a heavy winter coat that never came off. His parents had never pushed him toward basketball. They'd have been just as proud if he'd chosen to study agriculture or follow his father into the grain business, but the town had different ideas. Local business owners slapped "Go Nate" signs in their windows, and the elderly men who gathered for coffee at Murphy's Diner spent their mornings debating whether he was good enough to play for Indiana University or if he should consider Purdue. Instead, everything changed during a December game against cross-county rival Millbrook High when Nate scored 32 points and grabbed 14 rebounds in a performance that had the crowd on their feet for the entire fourth quarter. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "Harmon's Heroics." And suddenly, every conversation in town seemed to center around his potential. College letters started arriving daily, and Coach Peterson began getting calls from Division I programs across the Midwest, all asking the same question. Was Nate Harmon the real deal? The pressure intensified as Jefferson High marched through the regular season undefeated, with Nate averaging 26 points and 10 rebounds per game. The town's expectations grew with each victory, and what had once felt like supportive enthusiasm began to feel like something heavier and more demanding. His shooting percentage dipped slightly in February, and he started noticing how quiet the diner got when he walked in. How conversations stopped and eyes followed him with a mixture of hope and anxiety that made his stomach churn. By the time the sectional tournament arrived in March, Nate felt like he was carrying the entire town on his back. The gymnasium sold out for every game, with people driving from neighboring counties just to watch the kid from Cedar Falls who might be there. Ticket to basketball glory. His parents tried to keep things normal at home, but even they couldn't hide their excitement when Duke University called during dinner one Tuesday night, and Nate realized that basketball had stopped being fun and started being a responsibility. He wasn't sure he wanted to carry. The call came from Coach Peterson on a Tuesday morning in early March, just as Nate was finishing his breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast that his mother had prepared with nervous precision. "Big news, son." Peterson's voice crackled through the phone with barely contained excitement. "Indiana University wants to offer you a full ride, contingent on how we finish in the tournament. Coach Williams is coming to watch our sectional final personally." The words hung in the air like a prayer answered, and Nate felt his parents' eyes boring into him from across the kitchen table where they sat frozen with coffee mugs halfway to their lips. The Indiana University offer represented everything his family had quietly hoped for, but never dared to speak aloud. His father made decent money at the grain elevator, but not enough to pay for college without significant loans. And his mother had been setting aside $20 from each paycheck for years in a coffee can labeled Nate's future that sat on top of the refrigerator. The full scholarship would not only guarantee his education, but also fulfill a dream that stretched back generations in a state where basketball was woven into the very fabric of identity and belonging. The town's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Murphy's Diner hung a banner that read, "Future Hoosier," and the local radio station began counting down the days until the sectional final with hourly updates. Business owners who'd never spoken to Nate before started stopping him on the street to offer encouragement, and the mailman began delivering good luck cards from elementary school students who'd had drawn pictures of him in an Indiana uniform. The attention felt suffocating, but Nate couldn't bring himself to complain about something that everyone else viewed as a blessing. Coach Peterson intensified their practice schedule, adding extra sessions focused specifically on the high-pressure situations they were likely to encounter in the tournament. The coach was a 20-year veteran who'd seen talented players crumble under expectations, and he spent hours with Nate working on mental preparation techniques and breathing exercises designed to keep him calm when the stakes were highest. "Talent gets you to the dance," Peterson would say during these sessions. "But composure wins championships, and championships change lives." The sectional tournament began with a comfortable victory over Riverside High, a game where Nate scored 31 points and played with the kind of effortless confidence that made basketball look easy. The crowd was electric, the team chemistry was perfect, and everything felt like it was falling into place exactly as it should. Local photographers captured every moment, and the next day's newspaper featured a full-page spread with predictions about how far Jefferson High might advance in the state tournament. As the sectional final approached, Nate found himself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling and visualizing every possible scenario. He'd practiced the game-winning shot thousands of times in his driveway, but now that it might actually matter, the pressure felt different. His mother noticed his loss of appetite, and his father tried to ease the tension with stories about his own high school baseball career. But nothing could quiet the voice in Nate's head that whispered about all the ways things could go wrong. The week before the sectional final, Nate made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. Instead of trusting his preparation and natural ability, he began overthinking every aspect of his game. analyzing video footage until his eyes burned and practicing his shooting form until his muscles ached. He convinced himself that he needed to be perfect, that anything less than a dominant performance would disappoint everyone who'd invested their hopes in his success. And in trying to guarantee victory, he planted the seeds of his own downfall. The sectional final against Oakwood High was supposed to be Jefferson's coronation. But from the opening tip, nothing went according to plan. Nate's first shot, a mid-range jumper that he'd been making consistently all season, clanked off the front rim, and the sound echoed through the gymnasium like a warning bell. The crowd, which had been buzzing with anticipation, suddenly grew quiet, and Nate could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him like a physical force that made his movements feel clumsy and mechanical. Oakwood had clearly done their homework, employing a defensive strategy that involved constant double teams and physical play, designed to frustrate him into making mistakes. Every time he touched the ball, two defenders converged on him, and the referees seemed to be allowing more contact than usual, turning what should have been a showcase of his skills into a grinding, physical battle. His teammates, who'd been feeding off his confidence all season, began to press and force shots of their own, and the fluid offense that had carried them through the regular season devolved into a chaotic mess of individual efforts by halftime. Jefferson trailed 38-32, and the locker room felt like a funeral parlor. Coach Peterson tried to rally the team with an emotional speech about heart and determination, but Nate could see the doubt creeping into his teammates' eyes. The local radio announcer's voice drifted through the locker room walls, discussing whether this might be the end of Jefferson's magical season, and Nate felt the crushing realization that he might be letting down not just himself, but an entire community that had pinned their hopes on his success. The third quarter was a disaster. Nate's frustration boiled over into bad decisions, and he picked up his fourth foul with 8 minutes remaining, forcing Coach Peterson to bench him for crucial possessions. The crowd, which had been supportive but nervous, began to grow restless, and Nate could hear individual voices calling out suggestions and criticisms that cut through him like knives. His parents sat in their usual seats behind the bench, his mother clutching his father's arm with white knuckles, both of them watching their son's dreams slip away, possession by possession. When Nate returned to the game with 5 minutes left, Jefferson trailed by 9 points, and the Indiana University coach was nowhere to be seen in the stands. The scholarship offer that had seemed like a certainty just hours earlier now felt like a distant memory, and Nate found himself playing, not for victory, but for damage control. Every missed shot was magnified, every turnover was scrutinized, and he could feel the collective disappointment of the crowd settling over the gymnasium. Like a heavy blanket dot, the fourth quarter became a blur of desperation and diminishing returns. Nate's teammates, recognizing that their season was slipping away, began forcing shots and making risky plays that only accelerated their demise. The more they pressed, the more mistakes they made, and Oakwood's lead grew to 12 points with 3 minutes remaining. The crowd began filing toward the exits, and Nate heard someone behind the bench say, "I guess he wasn't as good as we thought," words that would echo in his head for years to come. With 30 seconds left and Jefferson down by 4, Nate managed to score on a driving layup and draw a foul, completing the three-point play to cut the deficit to 1. The crowd erupted with desperate hope, and for a moment, it felt like the old magic might return. But Oakwood responded with a clutch three-pointer that restored their lead. And when Jefferson got the ball back with 8 seconds remaining, down by 4 points, everyone in the gymnasium knew that the fairy tale was over and the real world was about to begin. The shot that would define Nate's life came with 2.3 seconds left on the clock. Jefferson down 67-64, and the weight of an entire town's dreams resting on his shoulders. Coach Peterson had drawn up a perfect play during the timeout. A screen and roll designed to get Nate an open three-pointer from his favorite spot on the floor, the same left wing where he'd made hundreds of clutch shots throughout his high school career. The inbound pass was perfect, the screen was solid, and for one crystalline moment, everything aligned exactly as it should have. Nate caught the ball in perfect position. His feet set, his form textbook, and the crowd held its collective breath. As he rose up for the shot that would either send the game to overtime or end Jefferson's season, the ball left his fingertips with perfect rotation, tracing a beautiful arc through the air toward the rim, and for a split second, it looked like destiny was about to be fulfilled. The gymnasium was so quiet that you could hear the whistle of the ball cutting through the air. And Nate's follow-through was so perfect that he started to raise his arms in celebration before the ball even reached its target. The shot hit the back iron with a metallic clang that seemed to echo forever, bounced straight up in the air, and then fell harmlessly to the floor as the buzzer sounded. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum of sound that seemed to suck all the air out of the building, and Nate stood frozen in his follow-through position, unable to process what had just happened. The Oakwood players erupted in celebration. The referees raised their arms to signal the end of the game, and slowly, the reality of failure began to settle over the Jefferson High Gymnasium like a dark cloud. His teammates surrounded him immediately, offering words of encouragement and telling him it wasn't his fault. But Nate couldn't hear them through the roar of his own disappointment. His parents rushed down from the stands, his mother's eyes red with tears, his father's face a mask of stoic support, and they wrapped him in a hug that felt like both comfort and suffocation. The local photographers captured every moment of his devastation, and he knew that the image of his missed shot would be replayed in the local newspaper and on social media for years to come. The locker room was a tomb of silence and shattered dreams. Coach Peterson tried to put the loss in perspective, talking about how proud he was of the team's effort and how they'd exceeded all expectations just by reaching the sectional final. But his words felt hollow against the magnitude of what had been lost. College scouts packed up their notebooks and headed for the exits, and Nate watched through the window as the Indiana University coach walked to his car without looking back, carrying with him the scholarship offer that would now go to someone else. In the days that followed, Nate discovered that failure in a small town was a public spectacle that never truly ended. The local newspaper ran a retrospective article about the season, with a photo of his missed shot prominently featured, and the radio station spent hours analyzing what went wrong. People were kind but distant, offering sympathetic smiles and well-meaning comments about how there would be other opportunities, but Nate could see the disappointment in their eyes and feel the weight of their unspoken questions about what might have been. The worst part wasn't the loss itself, but the way it changed how people looked at him. Where once he'd been seen as a rising star, destined for greatness, now he was viewed as a cautionary tale about the dangers of small-town expectations. The scholarship offers that had seemed guaranteed began to evaporate, and by graduation, Nate found himself facing the same uncertain future as every other 18-year-old in Cedar Falls, with the added burden of knowing that he'd had his chance at something special and let it slip through his fingers. 10 years later, Nate stood in the same Jefferson High Gymnasium where his dreams had died. But this time he was wearing a coaching shirt instead of a uniform. He'd returned to Cedar Falls 2 years earlier to help Coach Peterson, who was nearing retirement and needed an assistant with fresh ideas and a deep understanding of the game. The gym looked smaller than he remembered, the stands showing their age with faded paint and worn wooden bleachers. But the memories were as vivid as ever, especially when he stood on the spot where his life had changed forever. The occasion was a special exhibition game between current Jefferson High players and alumni, designed to raise money for new uniforms and celebrate the 10th anniversary of the sectional championship team that had finally achieved what Nate's squad had failed to accomplish. The crowd was smaller than those championship nights, maybe 800 people instead of 2,800, but the energy was warm and nostalgic, filled with families and former players who'd returned to reconnect with their basketball roots. Nate had been planning to just coach from the sideline, but when they ended up short on players, Coach Peterson had insisted he suit up and play. At 26, Nate was no longer the lean teenager who'd carried the town's hopes on his shoulders. He'd filled out through the chest and shoulders. His hairline had receded slightly, and he moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone who'd learned that basketball was a game of intelligence as much as athleticism. He'd spent the past decade playing in adult recreational leagues, industrial league teams, and weekend tournaments. Never quite able to walk away from the game that had defined so much of his identity, even though he'd never again experienced the pure joy he'd felt before that crushing defeat. The game itself was loose and fun, with current players mixing with alumni in a relaxed atmosphere that felt more like a family reunion than a competitive contest. Nate played point guard, distributing the ball and setting up his teammates, content to be a facilitator rather than a scorer. The crowd cheered for every made shot, regardless of which team scored, and there was an easy camaraderie that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with basketball in the first place, before the pressure and expectations had transformed it into something heavy and burdensome. With 3 minutes left in the game, the score was tied 78-78, and Coach Peterson called a timeout that felt different from the casual atmosphere that had prevailed throughout the evening. The competitive fire that had driven Jefferson High to so many victories was still burning in the old coach's eyes, and he looked at Nate with an expression that carried 10 years of unspoken understanding. "You know what you need to do, Peterson?" said quietly, and Nate felt his heart rate increase despite the low stakes and friendly competition. The crowd sensed the shift in energy and began to buzz with excitement as the teams returned to the floor. Nate found himself matched up against Billy Morrison, who'd been Oakwood's star player in that sectional final and was now a successful insurance agent, and the two men shared a knowing smile that acknowledged how much had changed since they'd faced each other as teenagers. The ball moved around the court with crisp precision, and with 30 seconds left, Nate's team had possession, trailing by 1 point, and everyone in the building knew exactly what was about to happen. The play developed naturally, without the elaborate schemes and desperate pressure of that night 10 years ago. Nate's teammates set a screen, he drove to his left, and suddenly he was in the exact same spot where his dreams had died, the left wing three-point line, with the game on the line. But this time, there was no crushing weight of expectation, no scholarship hanging in the balance, no entire town's future resting on his shoulders. This time, there was just the pure, simple joy of playing the game he loved. And when he released the ball, it felt like coming home. The shot swished through the net with a satisfying sound, and the crowd erupted in cheers that felt like redemption, forgiveness, and celebration all rolled into one perfect moment. The gymnasium erupted in applause, but this time, the cheers weren't desperate or demanding. They were warm, appreciative, and filled with the kind of unconditional support that Nate had forgotten existed. His teammates mobbed him at center court, and even the opposing players came over to shake his hand and offer congratulations, creating a scene that felt more like a family celebration than a competitive victory. Coach Peterson wrapped him in a bear hug that lasted longer than usual, and when they separated, Nate could see tears in the old coach's eyes that spoke to a decade of shared understanding about second chances and the healing power of time. In the years that followed, Nate's story became a different kind of legend in Cedar Falls. He never did get that college scholarship, and he never played professionally. But he found something more valuable in the process of rebuilding his relationship with basketball from the ground up. He married his high school sweetheart, took over his father's position at the grain elevator, and spent his evenings coaching youth basketball teams where he taught kids that missing shots was part of the game, not the end of the world. His approach to coaching was shaped by his own experience with failure, and he became known for his ability to help young players handle pressure and disappointment with grace and resilience. The made shot in the exhibition game didn't erase the memory of the missed shot that had haunted him for 10 years, but it transformed it into something different. He learned that redemption doesn't always look like we expect it to, and that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that happen when nobody's keeping score. The 17-year-old Hood carried the weight of an entire town's expectations, had grown into a man who understood that his worth wasn't determined by a single moment, And that true strength came from the ability to keep shooting, even after you'd missed the most important shot of your life. The sound of that swish would echo in his memory forever. Not as vindication for past failures, but as proof that it's never too late to find peace with the shots you've taken and the ones you've missed.